Okay. So thank you everyone for joining. As this is the first in a two-part series on forgiveness and compromise in the Talmud.
And this first Talmudic narrative that we're going to look at is a piece from Bavli, the Talmud Bavli and Yoma, 87a to 87b. And the topic is Mechila v'Piyus. It comes in the context of Yom Kippur and the Mishnah, which talks about how we get kapara, how we get forgiveness for different kinds of transgressions. And then the Talmud goes into this discussion about averot shebein adam l'chavero, averot shebein adam l'makom, whether there's a difference between getting forgiveness for transgressions against God versus transgressions against our fellow human beings. And that's where the conversation unfolds. And what this sugya kind of looks at is the mitzvah of appeasement. I'm not sure if you had thought about this before, or if any of you have this, there's a well-known minhag, right, of asking forgiveness before Yom Kippur. I don't know if you practice this. Does anyone here actually practice that? I know it's like a Facebook thing that people do, but okay, so Yaron says he does that. I'm sure you've done it at some point to ask forgiveness. And so we're going to look at the halachic requirement to ask forgiveness. Now we're not going to, there's a whole development of the sugya from Mishnah to Gemara through the Rishonim, through the halachic literature, the later halachic literature of specific requirements. This will be like the ground out of which that grows. We won't have time in this class to look at all of that. But instead we're going to look at this sugya, which has the following structure. So I wanted to lay this out for you. The Gemara is going to have four halachic statements, 4 memrot, and 4 stories, and that's the structure. And this is a really excellent piece in which to look at the dynamic between Talmudic narrative and the halachic pieces of Talmud. How do they interact with each other when they come up in one sugya? How are they meant to comment on each other and complement each other when they come up in a topic? And you'll see from the title of this source sheet, right? How do we learn from lived experience? From our lived experience, how does the lived experience shape the law, inform the law, and how does law inform our lived experience? Okay, that was our introduction. So to the topic of piyus, and this is the framing that we're going to use. Of piyus, the Talmud uses different phrases to refer to getting forgiveness or asking forgiveness. Piyus is one of them, l'fayes, to appease. But I'm curious from you, if you're willing to share, what emotional state, what psycho-emotional state do we need to be in when we ask forgiveness, or on the other end, allow ourselves to forgive? What's like the emotional dynamic that needs to happen? What place do you need to get to? You can think of a low stakes example, if that's easier, right?
Maybe humility.
Humility, sure, humility. Okay, and I want you to as we name these ideas, right, that's going to be a very strong theme. The Gemara itself is going to use phrases to refer to forgiveness that echo the theme of this emotional place that you have to be in, a humble place. You have to take yourself out of your own perspective. One of the main phrases that the Gemara here uses for forgiveness is nafag adate, to go out of, literally, adate. If you've learned Gemara, the da'at is your mind, right? To go out of your mind is to forgive, right? And that's kind of, it sounds crazy, but it may very well be expressing that it means to take on a broader perspective, right? To go out of your own personal perspective of replaying the story. They heard me this way. I know I was in the right. There's no other way to see this. And to be able to have some humility and say, maybe there were broader circumstances. Maybe something else was going on, and I could find that space to forgive. Maybe this isn't as important as I hold on to this pain, right? The pain is there and it's real. The hurt is real, but maybe I don't need to hold on to it for this long or in this way. right? So to humility, expanding our perspective. Yeah. Do we have any other emotional states come to mind, or other? What does it take to forgive? It's okay. We'll let the Gemara also fill in a lot of this, because after all, the rabbis in the Gemara were human. And there's a lot of humanity that's reflected in this. So again, that's why I love it as well. That's like what really gets me excited about learning Gemara, is seeing the rabbis as people and them struggling with the law, and then trying to figure out, how do I live with this? What does it mean? And how is it helping me live a better life? Okay, so our sugya will open up kind of a window to this process of getting forgiveness and giving forgiveness, granting forgiveness. And the sugya discusses a line from this Mishnah, which is quoted on top, which is Averot ben Adam lo makom. So Averot ben Adam lo makom, Yom Kippurim mechaper. So transgressions between us and God, Yom Kippur can ultimately give us forgiveness, or help us get that kapara, that forgiveness. But Averot ben Adam l'chavero ein Yom Kippurim mechaper ad sheyeretze et chavero. But Averot ben Adam l'chavero, okay, interpersonal transgressions, Yom Kippur doesn't work, right? Is not going to grant us forgiveness until ad sheyeretze et chavero, until you appease your fellow, the person that was wronged. And then we have our sugya, and it's followed by a discussion of bidui, of confessing the transgression. And like we said, we're going to see 4 halachic statements, 4 memrot, 4 stories, and we're going to see the interaction between the two. Okay, so let's begin. We're going to start with the stories, and the Gemara quotes different stories. We're going to, it opens with a bunch of drashot. We're going to come back to these drashot, these interpretations of the psukim, as we go. And we're going to start with story number 1, which is a story between Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Abba. Sorry, this is English. Let me just switch it to my Hebrew. Yirmiyah. Okay. So I am here, and I don't know, so I can make this bigger so that you can see it. But if you're viewing it on your home computer, do you guys have it open on your computer, or I can make it bigger?
I can open it.
You can open it. Awesome. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Well, for the folks at home, which is all of you. Okay. Okay. So we're at line 14. So, and Rabbi Yirmiyah Havale Milta le Rabbi Abba Bahadeh. So Rabbi Yirmiyah had beef, milta is a davar. He had a matter with Rabbi Abba. Okay. Right, so Rabbi Yirmiyah was wronged and wronged Rabbi Abba. Okay, there are different. It's vague who wronged whom here, but Rabbi Yirmiyah, we're going to read it like this, right? That Rabbi Yirmiyah was wronged, and he did the wronging to the one who was wrong, and he goes to Rabbi Abba. Okay, Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Abba B'Hadeh. And what did he do? So he goes to seek forgiveness. Azal eti vadasha de Rabbi Abba. He goes and he sits at the door of Rabbi Abba. And when his maid happened to be emptying a bucket, right, with dirty water, might be a chamber pot, might be something that was just cleaning the floor, okay? And she dumped it, and drips of water, of this dirty water, fell on Rabbi Yirmiyah's head. Amar, and he says about himself, as is a good practice for a rabbi, right? He's called to cite a pasuk. Asauni kashba, had been made like garbage. Kara anashen, he quoted a pasuk about himself. Me'ashpot yarim evyon. May this poor person be lifted up from the trash heap. Okay. Rabbi Abba hears Rabbi Yirmiyah saying this. He hears him outside. Oh, what's that noise? V'nafi klapein. He goes out to his face, and we're going to track this guiding word of face. And we're also, right, we mentioned the word nafakadate, right, to go out of your mind. To okay, so the imagery of the head and the face, the human to human encounter is going to be really, really important in this process of forgiveness. So Rabbi Abba goes and goes to see him, to see Rabbi Yirmiyah. Amar le, Hashra tzrichana lamei fakadatcha. Now the tables are flipped. I need your forgiveness, right? Because I don't know, my maid threw trash on your head. Okay. Dichtib lechi trapes rahav re'echa, right? There's this pasuk, and we can look at if I switch tabs, you can see it. Do you see Sefaria now?
Yeah.
Okay. Whenever we are learning a Gemara, right, we obviously go to the psukim. Let's look at the original psukim. This is the pasuk from Mishlei, from Proverbs, that talks about becoming a guarantor and kind of warns the reader, don't become a guarantor because it's a problem. It'll get you stuck. And it says, if you became a guarantor for your fellow, right, you stuck out your hand for a stranger, seems like a good thing, but they're saying don't do it. No kashta b'mrepicha, you're stuck, right? If he defaults on this loan, you're going to need to pay it. You're stuck with your word. You're trapped by your words. This is what you should do in order to be saved. Because you've come into the palm of your friend. Lech hitrapes v'rahav re'echa. Go grovel and badger your fellow. Go bother them. Okay, grovel, lower yourself. Right, hitrapes, and this is going to we're gonna look further at this. So, Rabbi Abba says to Rabbi Yirmiyah, right? It seems that I need to ask forgiveness from you, right? I have to make myself lowered before you. Okay, interesting story. Okay, so we have this first story of Rabbi Yirmiyah going to the one he wronged. And seeking him out, and then having the tables kind of turned on him and seeking forgiveness from the person that he wronged. Okay. All right. So next story, Rabbi Zera and the ambiguous man. Okay, so we've got 19. Okay, and as we're reading them, I want you to be thinking about how do these stories compare? Why would the Talmud quote all of them? Right? What are similarities, differences, and what dimension is each story adding to this process of understanding forgiveness, right? Granting and giving and asking for forgiveness. Yaron, I see a quizzical look. Do you have a question, comment, thought?
Yeah, I actually don't understand why he needs to apologize here at all. What did he do? It was his maid who threw out the garbage for the water.
Good. It's a weird resolution, right? Why did Rabbi Abba suddenly feel that he needed to apologize? And also, what happened to Rabbi Yirmiyah's apology, right? Like what he kind of goes up. What?
He got the garbage thrown on his head. That's like humbling himself.
Okay, so maybe it's equivalent, right? That Jonathan's making the argument that once Rabbi Yirmiyah already kind of was lowered, if the entire process of asking for forgiveness is about humbling myself, that's already been achieved, right? He doesn't feel the need to actually go see Rabbi Abba, right? We'll note here, right, that Rabbi Abba is the one who comes out to him, right? He doesn't go and knock on the door. He's just kind of pacing back and forth, and he's there, and he doesn't go in. Rabbi Abba is the one who actually makes the move towards Rabbi Yirmiyah. And is that enough, right? So it seems like Rabbi Yirmiyah didn't complete the process, unless you say, like Jonathan said, and the trash on his head was enough to kind of simulate the end result. But we don't have a real resolution there, right? It seems like, yeah, it's difficult, right? That Rabbi Abba was the one who ends up wanting to apologize. Like, where's the resolution? Other comments on this before we go to Rabbi Zera? Rabbi Zera, ki havale milta bahade inish. So he had a matter, right? That there was a wrong between him and another person. Havachali fitana lekame v'mamsile. Ki hechi denete v'nefok lemidate. He would pace back and forth. He would go to their house and pace back and forth in order to get forgiveness. Okay, so let's, is he doing the right thing? Okay, so if he had been harmed by someone, he would go to their house and make himself present so that the other person had the opportunity to ask for forgiveness. What do we think of Rabbi Zera? Is this the right approach to forgiveness?
He seems to be taking the initiative.
He's taking initiative, but he was the side who was wronged.
Ah,
Critique Rabbi Zera for me. What could Rabbi Zera have done much more easily than pace back and forth and wait for the guy to come out and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry"? There's an easier solution.
Like,
If you're the wrong party, what?
have just gone up to him and be more upfront about it.
Okay, again, right? Like, why didn't they actually knock on the door and say, "Hi, we have an issue. We should talk about it"? Sure. Okay. Or he could have just forgiven him in his heart at home, right? This is highlighting what's the actual issue when there's a wrong between two people, right? What needs to happen in that process of forgiveness? This story seems to say it's not enough that Rabbi Zera was prepared to forgive, right? That Rabbi Zera said, "You know what? Like, it's fine." Something had to happen on the side of the person who wronged him, right? The emotional dynamic, that emotional response of, I was wrong, I should humble myself, right? Okay, and that didn't happen here. So it seems, or at least Rabbi Zera was trying. It doesn't say what happens in the end. There isn't a resolution there, but Rabbi Zera is trying to get that to happen. Okay, Rav. Okay, third very complicated, emotionally complicated story. Rav Havalei Melta Bahadeahu Tapfa. Okay, Rav had been wronged by this butcher. And lo atzal the kameh, and as in the previous story, right? The person who did the wronging didn't come and ask for forgiveness from Rav. B'male yoma de Kippurei Amar Ihu, and on Erev Yom Kippur, right? This is he had this instinct. He's like, we need to let this go. We need to get this to be resolved. So Rav Azil, he says to himself, Azil Analif, you say, like, I'm going to go to him to appease him. And it would seem to be to get his to get him to forgive. On the way, Pagabe Rav Huna, as Rav is going to meet this tabach on Erev Yom Kippur, he's on a very important mission. Rav Huna, his student, finds him, and Amar Le, and he says to him, "Where are you going? Right? Where are you going on Erev Yom Kippur?" And he responds, "Amar Le, if you say Lefania, I'm going to get appeasement from Ploni, the tabach, the butcher." Amar, his student says to him, "I don't like the looks of this. Azil Abba Lemiktal Nafsha." Abba was his more familiar name. He says, "You're going to kill someone." Okay. At this point in the story, what could he do? What could Rav do? What are his options? Choose your own adventure.
Well, he could just not do that and wait.
Not do what?
Go to the guy.
He could not go to the tabach because the tabach's not seeking him out. What's Rav's motive to go to the tabach in general? What's it telling us about the obligation here in the story?
If he feels that the guy is obligated to apologize, he would be doing him a favor by prompting him to do it.
Yeah, or maybe maybe these rabbis feel that it's on them as the wronged party to go and get forgiveness, right? There's something that needs to be resolved and they're part of it. So they're going to initiate it. Okay, but he could have turned back. But I imagine, right, he's hearing his student going, that's really hyperbolic, right? What do you mean I'm going to kill someone? This is foreshadowing. Azal v'kami lave. So he goes and he meets the tabach, he meets the butcher. What was the butcher doing? He was butchering. Habayati v'kapali reisha. He was splitting the head of an animal, as a butcher does. And dale eine v'chazie. And as he approaches, Rav approached, he lifts his eyes and he sees Rav. Amar le abaat, calls him by his more familiar name. Clearly not impressed that he's there, not interested in his kavod, right? Oh, look, it's Abba. Zia lately miltabadach. Get out of here. I don't want to talk to you. What happens to the butcher? Bahati de kapale reisha. Okay, and we've got that head imagery again. As he is continues to split the head of this animal, Ishtamit Garma, the axe head, falls backwards. And it gets him in the throat, Vikatle. Okay, and it kills him. The butcher dies. Okay, so the prediction of Rav Huna comes true. Okay, he gets killed by, if we have a midah keneged midah here, why is he killed in his throat? What did he do wrong?
He said something wrong.
He said something wrong. He was very disrespectful to this important rabbi. Perhaps the initial wrongdoing was with speech. Who knows? Okay, and he's dead. Now, in this story, who is the good guy? In the story of Rav and the butcher, we have a dead man at the end. Who's at fault?
Well, either it's his fault for being negligent, or he was punished by God, and then it would, I guess, also be his fault.
Okay, interesting. You think it's on the Tabach, right? The Tabach was the one who should have been seeking forgiveness, and also it could have just been negligence at his place of work. Okay. Tell me from the story that it's Rav's fault.
Well, he was warned, right, that if he'd go through that.
Right? Why else do we have this interaction with Rav Huna on the way, right? They didn't tell me, oh, the trees were green as he walked through the forest that day to go meet this Tabach, right? They didn't tell me any other detail. They tell me he met his student, and his student was prescient enough to say, something is not going to go right? You're going to kill someone, and yet he persists. Why does he persist? He really wants to give forgiveness. Okay, so it would seem to be good intentions, but there's something off here, right? That he needed to have understood that in this scenario that wasn't going to happen. So we have blame giving for Rav, because Rav should have read the scenario. Rav should know when it's appropriate to go and try and get forgiveness and when not, right? In our other stories, when they go and they ask for forgiveness, we don't have a necessary resolution, right? It doesn't tell us, but no one dies. Okay, if this Tabach was so belligerent, it might have ended that way, and he should have read it, right? He should have read the situation. Okay, next story, fourth story. Rav have a pasik sidra kamei de Rebbe. Rav was reciting his teaching, right? He was teaching something in front of his teacher, Rebbe Huda Nasi, the teacher. Ayil ata Rabbi Chia, came Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia enters the Beit Midrash, and as a matter of kavod, hadar the reshe, he went back to the beginning of the teaching. Okay, and it's interesting. Again, we have this rosh sound and word appearing over and over again, right? The face and the head meeting people, understanding who they are, and giving them kavod, aggrandizing them, is a major theme in this story. And also lowering yourself on the other end when you need to forgive or seek forgiveness. Ata Rabbi Chanina Bar Chama. When Rabbi Chanina Bar Chama comes into the Beit Midrash. Oh, sorry, did I skipped some people? Yeah. Okay. He was teaching in front of Rabbi. Ayal Ata Rabbi Chia Hadar L'Reisha, he goes back. Ayal Ata Bar Kapara comes in. Hadar L'Reisha, he goes back to the beginning and starts his teaching all over. Ata Rabbi Shimon Bar Rebbe, and the son of the great teacher Rebbe comes in. Hadar L'Reisha, he goes back as a matter of kavod, as a matter of honor. Ata Rabbi Chanina Bar Chama, or when Rabbi Chanina Bar Chama comes in, you can imagine it's already late in the lesson. He's a latecomer. Okay, I've already gone back 3 different times. Amar Kulei Hai Nedar V'Nezal. Should I really go back again? The Lo Hadar, and he didn't go back. Ikpid Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina was insulted that Rav did not return to the beginning of his teaching for him. Azo Rav Ligabe, and Rav tried to seek him out, and he went to him 13 years in a row on Erev Yom Kippur, V'lo Ifais, and Rabbi Chanina did not accept his apology. Okay, so we maybe we'll go back to this piece at the end, but that's the story, right? He goes 13 times. He goes 13 times, and he does not receive forgiveness. Okay. Let's look at the first 3 stories and compare them, and then we'll go back to the drashot and connect them to each other.
All right. In the first three stories, okay, in the first three stories, not the, we're ignoring the fourth story for right now of Rabbi Hanina and Rav. Okay. In the first story, the person who's wronged, Rabbi Yirmiyah, goes to the one who he wronged, Rabbi Abba. And in the other two stories, it's the opposite, right? The one who wronged Rabbi Zera and Rav goes to the one who wronged them, the butcher and that unidentified man. Okay, and the endings also seem to be different in the first three stories. How are they different? What are the three endings of the stories? What happens in the first story? There's also a translation down here. And or Sfaria.
Yes, the first story is the only one where things work out.
The first story is the only one where they actually achieve resolution. And in the second two stories, okay, we don't have a resolution in the second story. And in the third story, there is tragedy, right? The butcher dies, okay? What's the significance of these differences? And further, okay, we can also ask on Rabbi Zera, why should the person who was hurt go to the person who did the hurting? Why isn't it enough for him to have forgiven him in his own home, right, on his own? Maybe he did worse by going to seek out the forgiveness. And further, right, we also said that's also strengthened by the fact that Rob's good intentions ends up in the death of the butcher. And these questions underlie the complicated dynamics in the process of seeking and giving forgiveness, which turns out to be a lot more complicated than what the Mishnah said, right? Until his friend is appeased, right? It seems like the emotions behind hurt and forgiveness and insult can even lead to death, right? And we have that famous teaching, right, of Kol Malbina Pnei Chavero B'Rabim. It's as if when you embarrassed your friend, causing their face to turn white in public, right? It's as if you killed them, right? And here we actually have a story where perhaps the butcher was embarrassed and actually it ends in death. Okay. We're going to move to the drashot. And we're going to see how they work with the stories. Okay, let's find Rav Yosef. Ramilei Rav Yosef and Rabbi Abba. So we're starting at the beginning here at line number 1. Okay, so we have the quote. We have the quote from our Mishnah. So Ramilei Rav Yosef marchavu l'Rabbi Abba. Is this really true? Are the averot, the interpersonal averot, the interpersonal transgressions, not alleviated by Yom Kippur, not forgiven by Yom Kippur? B'haktiv, it says in the Pasuk, in line number 3, Im yechata ish leish ufilo Elohim. If a person sins between themselves to another person, ufilo Elohim, the root pilel is either judgment, or in the more familiar usage, lihit palel, the way we use it, to pray. Okay, it's interesting that the word to pray means also to judge. Lihit palel in the reflexive might mean to judge yourself, to introspect. Okay, and the Gemara and the commentaries discuss the meaning of ufilu lo Elohim. Okay, so says the man Elohim, says the Gemara, who is Elohim in this pasuk? It's not that God judges us, right? That God forgives when it's ben adam l'chavero, interpersonal. Rather, Diana, right? That it's a judge. So it takes it out of the hands of God, and it doesn't actually contradict the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says ein yom kippurim mechaper, and we reinterpret the pasuk to match that it's not God forgiving you. It's not just this process of praying before God on Yom Kippur. It's a judge. It's going before a court. It's seeking resolution through a court. The Gemara continues and says, if that's true, then the seifa of the pasuk, the continuation of the pasuk says, but if you sin against God, who will intercede on your behalf? Who will pray for you? Okay, so that doesn't make sense, because that then if you reinterpreted Elohim, it doesn't parallel the second half of the pasuk. It says Hashem. Clearly in the second half of the pasuk, it's contrasting ben adam l'chavero in the first part, interpersonal, with ben adam l'makom, between God and the divine. So we have to reinterpret. Ela hachi kamar. It can't mean that. So instead, it means hachi kamar. Im yachata ish. Lo yishipalo, Elohim yimcholo. God will forgive him. V'im la'Hashem yachata ish mitpalel va'ado. But if you sin against God, who will pray for you? And it inserts, like it interpolates into the pasuk, tshuva and masim tovim. That's the process by which you get forgiveness from God. Okay. It's very difficult to claim that this is actually what the pasuk says. That's not what it says, right? This pasuk, if we look at it in the original, is a pasuk of Eliah Kohen. It's a statement of Eliah Kohen in the Mishkan, rebuking his sons. Okay, so sorry, I'm just going to pull that up on the sheet. Okay, I know I have it here. I can also tell you outside. All right. Oh, it's on the top. Sorry. And his sons don't respond to this rebuke. The pasuk actually says because God wanted to kill them. Okay, God wanted them to die, so that's why they don't listen. It's very difficult to claim that's actually the pasuk because Eli is seeming to say that there's a leniency here between if you sinned against God, the sons of Eliah Kohen, right? What did the sons of Eliah Kohen do? If we remember this story, what was their sin?
Ox and sacrificial meats.
They took the meat. They took more than their share of sacrificial meats, right? So they kind of did sin against God. They also slept with married women. Okay, they were not well-behaved priests. And so it would seem that the words of Eli seem to indicate there's a leniency between people and God, and that between people and people, because they can be judged by they can be judged by an earthly court. But between God and us, right? If you sin against God, who's going to actually intercede on your behalf? And the drasha that's added here switches it, right? And it tries to answer the question that we had raised, and it says by reordering the pasuk, it says asking forgiveness from a friend is actually equivalent to repenting and doing good deeds before God. Okay, and then the Gemara continues with a more practical application in the words of Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak says in line 8, anyone who angers their friend, even verbally, right, a verbal insult, needs to appease them. And he quotes a pasuk. This pasuk about the guarantor. Do this and be saved. Right, humble yourself before your friend. And it seems like the Gemara adds this commentary on this pasuk. If it's a monetary issue, right, you should pay. But if not, bring extra people, increase friends upon him, it seems to say, which is odd, right? So Rabbi Yitzchak says, paying money or even bringing extra people to ask forgiveness in front of them is what the pasuk is telling us to do. And the pasuk actually warns you and says, don't become this guarantor. Okay, actually insulting of someone who insulting another person, when you insult the kavod of your friends, in order to fix the situation, harbet alav re'im, right? In order to get out of that trap, right? No kashta be'im re'picha, the trap that you set with your mouth. You have to do, when you insult the other person, when you insult their kavod, you need to kind of reenact that or experience the embarrassment or the shame that you brought upon them. So what you do in response is harbet alav re'im, and that's the chidush of this pasuk. Right? Monetary restitution makes sense. It's one for one, right? You owe him money, pay him money. But if it was a verbal insult, an emotional insult, something that happened between the two of you, you can't right? Your friend is carrying around this hurt. And the most you could do is Harbel of Re'im, like reenact the scenario by bringing people in order to publicly kind of admit you're wrong, right? And admit that this is what I did. This was my sin. This is my transgression. And I'm going to feel a little bit of the pain that you felt when I wronged you. Okay, and we're going to see that come out in the other stories as well, right? So that's a theme that we see in the other stories. Rav Chizda adds, so Rav Chizda's story adds onto this, right? I'm going to reenact the hurt and feel a little bit of the hurt that I caused you in order to seek reparation. Rav Chizda says, you need to actually seek appeasement in front of 9 people, 3 rows of 3 people. Shene Amar, and he brings a pasuk from Eov, another fascinating pull from a section where they're saying to Eov to right the wrongs that he's made against God. His friends are arguing that you need to admit in front of people. Chatati v'ashar ha'aveti v'lo shavali. Right? I've sinned, and I've I don't know how to translate that right now. I'm going to pull up the pasuk. Okay, chatati v'ashar ha'aveti. Okay, I have perverted what was right, but I was not paid back for it. But it wasn't worth it, right? This is what his friends are telling Eov. You need to make this declaration. Now, there's an interesting contrast. This pasuk is about sins between God and man, but it's being invoked here to tell us about how to make reparations between us and another person when we wrong them. So this is the source of Rav Chizda's drasha. He says you have to do it, and you have to ask for appeasement in front of 9 people. And we see in the bringing of that pasuk that the sugya is probably being intentional, right? And kind of making this equivalence between wronging God and wronging people, right? There isn't this stark dichotomy that we thought existed in the Mishnah, that right? You need to ask appeasement, but Yom Kippurim works. Actually, the lines aren't so clear, right? You sin against a person, you also sin against God. Okay. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Hanina. Let me see if I have notes on that for a second. If we move to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Hanina, okay, the third one, okay. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Hanina adds another halachic statement. Sorry, in line number 12, that tells me call matu mechavero, another term for asking forgiveness. Anyone who asks forgiveness from their friend, al yavakesh mimenu yoter mishalosh pamim, shouldn't ask more than 3 times. Shinamar, ana sana v'ata sana. This is quoting a pasuk from the story of Yosef and his brothers, which we just read recently in Shul, where the brothers seek forgiveness from Yosef by telling him, right, your father, right, our father, Yaakov, on his deathbed, before he died, told us, this is what you should say to Yosef, ana sana v'ata sana. You should forgive the wrongs of your brothers. Okay, Kotam Ruli Yosef. Anasana pesha achecha v'chatatam. Forgive their offense. Kira ag malucha, they've done wrong by you. Vatasana lepesha avdei elokei abicha vayif Yosef b'dovram elav. And he hears this obviously and is very pained by their even supposition that he might not forgive him. He might not forgive them. Okay, but the source. So that's the source. For getting 3 rows of 3 people. What's it based on? How do we get this from that pasuk? What do you see? You're counting your own, or no?
Well, no, I'm just confused. Why are we using a fictitious story as a source?
So, okay, that's interesting. I don't know that everyone reads it in that way. Not every parshan reads it as, it's just not recorded anywhere else in Breshit that this dialogue happened. It could be that this dialogue happened and was like off stage. Could be.
Okay.
I don't know. What was your impression when we read this in shul recently? How did you read this story?
I'd always read that or understood it to be kind of the brothers worry that Yaakov is about to die, the protection is going to go away, and now Yosef's going to go and unleash his fury on them. So they make up this whole story of, Yaakov told us to tell you to forgive us, or not to unleash your fury on us.
You also read it like I did, that they made it up. Yeah. Okay. I don't know. Anyone else have ideas on that of how we could, that's my best resolution is that maybe there is like they're understanding it as something that is describing a real request. It was just off scene, off stage.
Maybe it shows that for the sake of peace or for the sake of resolution of a conflict, you're allowed to lie a little bit.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Right. So maybe it teaches us that you can distort the truth for the sake of shalom bait or shalom among the family.
Right.
How does Rav Chisda get that you need 3 rows of 3 people from this pasuk? Whether it's true or not, whether it was an actual process of forgiveness that Yaakov was describing.
Let's see.
I can drop the link also. What'd you say, Jonathan?
Anna, Sana, and Sana another time.
Okay, so we have Anasana, Vatasana. So I think there's a Ana, Sana, and Atasana. So we have the na 3 times, and that's the asking, please, please, please. Right, so 3 times, 3 requests. So that's three rows of people with 3. I don't know where that would get 3 people each. We'd have to count Anasana, 1, 2, 3. Atasana, 1, 2, 3. I don't see another a set of 3 words. So I don't know where you get 3. You think Ana itself is a set?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know how else to get there.
I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. Okay. But here we have Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina saying you can't ask. So we have the 3 rows of 3. Okay. And Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina saying you can only ask 3 times. So right, this isn't proving the 3 rows of people. It's saying that you can only ask 3 times. Okay, why might that be? And then where did we see this contradicted?
Oh, we saw contradicted the guy who went 13 years in a row.
Yeah. Okay, so we had the guy who went 13 years in a row asking forgiveness. Okay, so we'll jump over there. That was exactly the Gemara's challenge to him. Heichi abitachi. So he says you can only ask for 3 times. We can imagine the reason, right? If the person who had the person seeking forgiveness is lowering themselves, right? They're making their effort, and we see that it has to be a 2-way street on both ends, right? That emotional turning of saying I'm ready to admit my wrongdoing, and the emotional turning of saying I'm ready to open my heart and forgive. But if you come to that person 3 times and legitimately ask for forgiveness and they're not ready to do that, you're probably going to make things worse. Okay, right? It's not going to, you have to be attuned to what's actually happening in the dynamic. It's not just a formal process of bring 3 people, say these words, and you'll notice that they're even different. The Ana, Sana, Vatasana are 3 different ways of formulating, please forgive, right? So you have to actually use language that you think is going to work, not just repeat some sort of formula. It's not just following the specific laws that are laid out in the Mishnah. It's reading the situation, right? Which Rav and the Tabach could have used, right? That story of Rav and the Tabach, really, he should have read the situation a lot better. But if we go and we raise the challenge, why then did Rav go and ask forgiveness 13 times from Rabbi Chanina? Says the Gemara in line 39. Hey, how did he do this? The Hamar of Yossi Rabbi Chanina, back in the beginning of the sugya, right there, what we just read, said, anyone who asks forgiveness from their friend shouldn't ask more than 3 times. Says the sugya, Rav Shani. Rav is different, or it could be a teacher is different. You shouldn't ask from your teacher more, right? That was their relationship, student and teacher. And a Rav Shani. So the halachic decisors read this differently, and based on the different Rishonim's interpretation of what practically should you do, who's allowed to ask more than once. Rav Shani, perhaps Rav knew the relationship, and he was he knew he needed to get this forgiveness, and he wouldn't get further angered by this. It wouldn't harm the relationship more. And so he was able to go many times, and it was okay. Okay, but the Gemara continues and says, there's not only the obligation on the side of the person who wronged to read the situation, to ask for forgiveness, and be attuned to what the dynamics are. It's also on the person who is wrong to forgive. How do you do that? Why did he not forgive? And this is also really interesting. Rabba had previously stated, anyone who goes over their own midot and does their own midah work, and in this situation would forgive. They're forgiven, meaning it's a laudable thing to do midah work, to broaden your heart, to forgive, and to reflect. Okay, how did Rabbi Hanina not forgive? The Gemara says, Ella, Rabbi Hanina Rabbi Hanina saw in a dream that Rav, about Rav, dizakfu bedikla, that he was hung on a palm tree. Okay, and clearly when you see someone hung up on a palm tree, it means they're going to ascend to greatness, right? That's the assumption, right? And that's what the commentaries say. Ugmiri, and he understood from that dream, he was going to become the head of the academy. Now, Rabbi Hanina was the head of the academy at the time. And he did, so we can read this story in one of two ways. And he said to himself, and you'll tell me what your impression is. He says to himself, Amar Shmamina, I should understand from this dream, Ba'e lemebad Rishuta. He is going to want to become an authority. V'lo ifais, and so he wouldn't forgive him. Ki hechi delezal v'ligmar oraita bevavel, so that he would go and learn Torah in Bavel, and he becomes the founder of Sura, the great center of Torah learning in Bavel. Okay, who's in the wrong in this story? Who did the right thing? Who did the wrong thing? How do you read this? Right, Rabbi Hanina saw in a dream that Rav was going to be great in Torah and was going to come into a position of leadership. And he said, okay, I'm not going to forgive him, so that he goes to Bavel. What was Rabbi Hanina doing? Was it right? Was it wrong?
Getting rid of the competition.
He didn't, what do you say?
He's getting rid of the competition there.
He's getting rid of his competition. Okay, one way to read this, right? He says, oh, he's got real potential. He might replace me as head of the academy. I don't want that. So I'm not going to forgive him. And it's going to push him out of town. Other reads?
Isn't he, by not forgiving him, doesn't he actually fulfill kind of the dream of having him go to Bavel and become the great rabbi that he was?
Right. Like what would have happened in Jonathan's vision, right? If he would have stayed and become a Rosh Yeshiva there, he wouldn't have gone on to found Sura and the Yeshiva in Sura and become a great, that wouldn't have become a great center of Torah learning. So perhaps his withholding of forgiveness was actually just in order to fulfill this prophecy. And he did the right thing. Okay. So in all of these stories, if we want to wrap up soon, in all of these stories, we see a theme, and we see that. All right, what would you take away from all of these stories? How would you summarize? And I'll give you a short read on it. It's based on themes that we've already seen. How would you tie these all together? What have you learned about the process of forgiveness and granting forgiveness, getting forgiveness and granting forgiveness?
It's more complex than it's presented or than it seems.
Okay, it's more complex than it seems. Yes. Yeah. We'll look at the Rambam in a second and he'll summarize for us.
Yeah, it's hard to connect them all since everything goes differently in all of them.
Yeah, things go differently in all of them. Okay, so let's talk about the story. So Rabbi Yirmiyah and insulting Rabbi Abba, he gets dirty water on his head. And it would seem that the situation shows the emotional state of that person who seeks forgiveness, right? They should be in a place where they lower themselves, where they humble themselves, and they understand what the person that they wronged went through. It also seems that there's a hidden critique of Rabbi Yirmiyah for sitting at the door of Rabbi Abba's house and not actually going in to face him, right, to actually see him. He expected to be met right halfway, kind of. I mean, not halfway, but maybe 3/4 way, having already made the first steps of reconciliation. But the story tells us that this isn't enough, right? Even though Rabbi Abba eventually comes out to see Rabbi Yirmiyah, it's only after Rabbi Yirmiyah is forced to lower himself by having that dirty water thrown on his head. And that role reversal kind of puts it on Rabbi Abba, like Yaron said, like makes it kind of problematic that Rabbi Abba ends up needing to seek forgiveness himself, maybe, or that he feels it. And the story of Rabbi Zera teaches us that there might be a higher road to take in this process. That Rabbi Zera puts himself in front of the person who insulted him so that they're moved to ask for forgiveness. And he likely was already ready to forgive, but he knew that the person who wronged also needed to go through a process in this give and take, that he needed to forgive that person to his face, right? That there's also that kind of redemption that happens when they're met face to face, and when the person who wrongs recognizes I did something wrong, and they're received, right? The person who they wrong says, okay, I understand and I accept it, right? There's an emotional resolution that needed to happen, right? That giving up of your own personal honor and the subsequent raising up of the honor of the person who you wronged, right? There needs to be that equalizing that happens, because that's the opposite dynamic of what happened when you wronged the person. And perhaps that's why it even says it from the perspective of the one who did the wronging, right? Until you appease your friend, and not until your friend is appeased, right? So you have to bring them up. Lower yourself and bring them up. That's your obligation as the one who wronged. And the third story tells us that this behavior, however, requires real sensitivity, right? It builds on it and says the butcher wronged Rav. Rav Huna saw that this was not going to go well, but it frames it as if Rav is guilty because approaching the butcher pushed him into a corner, right? It said it caused the opposite kind of movement, right? Instead of the butcher feeling humbled, recognizing his wrong, it pushed the butcher even further up, right? He calls him by his colloquial name. He calls him Abba, right? He's disrespectful again. And then when he is approached, he says, lately Milta, I don't have, right? I don't have any matter to you. Why are you even talking to me? It raises him even higher, instead of achieving that dynamic of lowering the person who did the wronging, of them experiencing the hurt and maybe the being put in your place, kind of, but in a positive way of making restitution. And further, right, it seems that Rav maybe, right, because the butcher wasn't ready, Rav further embarrassed the butcher and it killed him. And the last story talks about the obligation of the person who forgives. When the Gemara says, how could it be that Rav asked so many times for forgiveness from Rabbi Hanina? The Gemara says he was different. He was machmir in this situation, or maybe he was a different kind of person again, right? It was a different scenario. But the Gemara's question itself seems to say that it's not just a recommendation, but it is an obligation. And there's a problem with asking more than 3 times, because, right, 3 is obviously just the number that the Gemara likes to pick a lot. And so it's forgetting the formal aspect of 3 times. It seems like this would be a rounding out of the process of reversing that dynamic of what happened when the wrong occurred. After the one who insults is able to, the one who did the wrong is able to go through this humbling and give up on their own honor. And in that, and at least for one moment, there's this danger that the person who is forgiving will say, you know what, I'm feeling really good about myself at this moment. I see you in this lowered place and I don't want to forgive you. I'm going to stay up here instead of, right, the lower, they came down here and they put the other person up there. And he says, I'm going to stay up here, right? There's that danger that the equalization won't happen. And so it's kind of limited to just 3 times. because if the dynamic's not going to be fixed, then there's no point in pushing it further. It'll just make the imbalance worse. And Rabbi Abba,
Can I just ask one question on that though?
sure, go
Either
ahead.
3 times, or do they have to be authentic, like a real, asking of forgiveness? Or because if not, maybe I can go in and ask 20 times and it's still not really fulfilling the 3 times of asking forgiveness.
Yeah, so the halachic sources actually talk about this. And I want to see, I'm going to stop the share for a second. I want to see if the Rambam brings that up. But the halachic decisors actually say that you should ask at different times in different scenarios. Because of exactly what you're saying. It shouldn't be formalistic. This whole thing is about seeing the face of the other, understanding the emotional process of what happens when one person wrongs another, empathizing, right? Going out of your own perspective and realizing what the other person is experiencing. And to do it in this formalistic way of saying, okay, I'll say it 3 times and maybe I'll use different language, but I'll say it 3 times in a row, separated by 20 seconds, right? Clearly misses the point, right? So it's this whole sugya, what I think the stories teach us, right? To go away from the formalism, right? To understand that there are real people and real feelings behind this, that you have to inform it, right? The 3 times can't just be 3 times in a row. It needs to be 3 times, 3 different scenarios. Try using different language, right? Take a break from each other, go and contemplate why at this point they're not ready to forgive, or why at this point is that person not ready to come to me in order to ask forgiveness, right? To think about what the other is going through. That's the most important part, and all the stories seem to illustrate that. But we also learn that asur la'adam liot achsari, right? A person, the mochel, the forgiver, is not allowed to be cruel, lo yitpayes, right? And not accept forgiveness. This is what the Rambam teaches. It's the Rambam, Mishnah Torah, and Hilchot Tshuva, Perek Bet, in Halacha Yud, right? And it says you can't be cruel. Even if he really pained you and sinned against you many, many times. Lo yikom v'lo yitor, right? There's also a prohibition against getting revenge, right? If they really sincerely went through this process of self-reflection and asking for forgiveness, you can't take revenge on them and say no. V'zeu darkam shel Zera Yisrael v'libam hanachon. And that's the way of Jews and in the right way, right? So that's what you're supposed to do. There's also this formalization of actually setting up this row of 10 people, right? So or setting up the rows of people, or doing it in front of other people. The last piece, a piece of the sugya which we didn't see, talks about imet. What happens if the person that you wronged died? So what you, right, there's no possibility of meeting them face to face anymore. There's no possibility of resolution, of empathizing and going through that whole process of seeing the other, right, the face and meeting them in person. So what do? You have to meet. So I'm going to read to you from the language of the Rambam. If you sinned against your friend and they died, and before you were able to ask forgiveness, you bring 10 people, and you set them up and you stand on their grave, on his grave. And you say in front of them, Chatati la Hashem Elokei Yisrael. I've sinned against God, the God of Israel. Vilaploni zeh, and to this person, shekach v'kach asiti lo, and you're specific about what you did, right? And that's part of the vidui of actually saying what you did explicitly, right? And there's the halach conversations around when is it appropriate to actually say what you did, if it causes more pain. Again, bring in the element of empathy and human understanding and emotional intuition and knowledge, and don't say it if it'll further embarrass them. But here, right, the person is dead, right? So in front of the 10 people, you say, I this is what I did, right? Admitting that chait, just like friends urge Eov to do. And right, if it's monetary, you repay that to his inheritors. right? But so in this last piece that talks about when the person died, the scenario where the person died, we see again this kind of melding and the blurring of the boundaries between hurting other people and sinning against God, right? If this person died, we say, "Chatati laHashem Elokei Yisrael v'lo ploni zeh shekach v'kach asiti lo," right? It's not only against this person that I sinned, that I transgressed, but against God. And I think throughout this sugya, we see this blurring of these lines, and the goal of all of this discussion and of all the stories pushing us to empathize and see the person, meet them, right? Don't just stand by their door, but knock on the door and see them face to face, is not only to understand and empathize with the other person's experience, but to see them as the face of God, right? And to understand that wronging them is also wronging God, and don't think that those two things are separate from each other. That when we wrong each other in this realm, it also has reverberations in higher realms and on a divine level. And that's why the Gemara gives such importance to this process of mechila and piyus, of seeking appeasement, seeking forgiveness, and granting forgiveness. Right? It has cosmic repercussions, and we should understand that and take it seriously. Thoughts, comments, questions as we close out for tonight.
Very stimulating thought.
Yeah.
And interesting stories, even though they're very, very terse.
All right. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for all your participation. I hope to see you at part 2. We'll talk about, the Gemara has, there are many more stories that talk about reconciliation, and the Gemara plays with it. So the second piece we'll do is about compromise, not about saying sorry, but about reaching compromise with each other. And the Gemara does this thing again, where it like creates this pastiche of different stories and has us juxtapose all of them to create like a layered vision of what it means to reach compromise, to understand each other, to meet each other as humans, and where does God fit into that? That's how it always works, the intertwining of the divine and the human. So I hope to see you next time. And thanks for joining. Have a good night, everybody.
Sure.
Yeah.
So does the act of asking for forgiveness or even receiving forgiveness, I'm assuming that act and process doesn't necessarily absolve you of punishment. You could still be punished for the act.
Well, the Mishnah uses the language of kapara, like mechaprim. So why would that be? The implication would not be what you said. I'd imagine, right? If they're saying this is the ticket, right?
Yeah.
Right, monetary wrongdoing, pay the money, right?
Right.
Emotional wrongdoing,
yeah,
get forgiveness.
Yeah, you gave the example.
That's different, right? There's what we like, the process we need to go through, and Yom Kippur, right? Like that's what the Mishnah actually talks about, right? You still owe the korbanot, right? It's not like you can't just have Yom Kippur.
Right, but like even in the example of, you cause physical damage, emotional suffering to somebody, you go up to the person, you ask for forgiveness, you are forgiven by the person, you still have to own up to the Beit Din or to God. There could still be direct punishment for that, right? I stole from you, you now forgive me, I paid you back, but isn't there still don't I have to go to jail? Don't I have to go through whatever process of kind of man-made punishment, God-oriented punishment?
So there isn't jail in halacha,
right?
So right, we have this other.
But there's mitah, right? So what if it's more extreme, right? If I killed somebody, I go and ask forgiveness of the family, they forgive me. I ultimately still have to pay dues, don't I?
Yeah, I mean, there's punishment for killing people, right? If you kill someone b'mezid, you die, right? It's capital offense. If you kill someone b'shogeg, right? And the Torah describes like going to live in this. That's like kind of one of the quasi jail examples, right? Is the Ir Miklat, right? You killed someone b'shogeg, you go and you have to stay in this place forever, and you can't leave until the Kohen Gadol dies. Like that's kind of jail.
Right, but asking for forgiveness doesn't help you there. You still have to go through it.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Right. That's why the examples that are given aren't I killed someone, right? It's that I
Right.
insulted them, right? And it's elevating that insult to say this actually matters, right? You can't ignore it. Something needs to happen here, right? Even though there isn't a dead body present, right?
Right.
This matters. We're giving it real weight. You need to take into account their emotions, go through this experience, feel what they felt, and empathize, open your heart, ask for forgiveness, humble yourself. Yeah. So it's just, I think it's doing what you said for the other sins, right? The other transgressions, where it's easy to say, right, there's a fitting punishment, or there's a punishment that's prescribed. And here it's kind of more amorphous, right? If I harm someone emotionally, what is there to repay? Or, right, I'm not going to get killed for that.
Right.
And if it's not money, so then what do I do? And the sugya is saying this has real weight, and here's what you do.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. So there's also halachic sources. So like you mentioned before, of people who don't deserve forgiveness, or people whose offenses are kind of beyond forgiveness, beyond what we saw of Rabbi Drach's statement, which makes a lot of sense coming from the sugya. The Ramah, of Moshe Isserlis, actually says in his Haggah, in his comment to the Shulchan Aruch Or Chaim 6061, he says that an injured party may withhold forgiveness if he does so with the intention of benefiting the offender. And such benefit may include, and this is a explanation, such benefit may include enabling the aggressor to achieve a state of humility, or helping him see his evil ways. So if there isn't, right, so this is Rabbi Drach bringing up like a halachic ruling, right, of saying if the person who harmed you doesn't actually go through this process, doesn't have remorse, is not self-reflective, you can withhold forgiveness, because maybe that's even part of the process of saying, okay, this is the tool you have, right? You're not supposed to give it away. You're not supposed to forgive at all costs. It needs to be mutual. It's a two-way street. Yeah. And I shared the source sheet with you, so you can look at it there. But Rabbi Drach writes much more extensively on it. I just found some paragraphs where he quoted our sugya. Yeah. Okay. There's much more to say. If you want to find, I mean, if you find any more on sources on this, or anything that is in conversation with the sources that we've seen, I'd be happy to see it. This is a sugya that I've learned and taught a couple times, so I'd be interested to see it. I have a lot more halachic material I could share with you if you're interested in going deeper, and a lot more Rishonim commentary on the different machlokot on the sugya. So reach out if you'd like to learn more. It's a pleasure learning with you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Have a good everyone.
Thank you.